Sam, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is Sam Linus. I wonder if any of you are EMTs or nurse practitioners, right? Any doctors in the group? No? Because I would welcome your opinion once in a while, what you've learned. Now, there are three things about which we can do nothing. One is, I got new medication for my asthma, and it's butchering my vocal cords, so my voice has gone high and it's a little crackly, and I can't do anything about that. Number two, I'm 90 years of age, and my cognitive powers are failing. So every once in a while, I'll probably not be able to think of a word or a place. So Alan has promised to jump in and supply the missing word. And the third thing is that this is a skylight, and this would look better if it were darker in this room, and we can't do anything about that. So I'm going to be free to use this to point out some things that you may not see because of the light in the room. Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do, and I may have to read this. I'm first going to talk about the scene, what we're talking about. We're talking about being 400 or 500 miles offshore where communications and rescue are limited. So you're 1 day or 2 days away from rescue. And under the theory that the captain is responsible for the comfort and safety of his crew, the captain's going to have to know a little more than how to put a Band-Aid on. So we're going to talk about the scene. Communications. You have to have a way of communicating. Now, even though that's not a medical problem, it has to do with how you can deliver medical care. The resources, I'm going to recommend a book. I have no financial interest in it, but it's a good one. The human factor, what you're willing to do. I'm talking about liability, who's to blame, triage, medical kits, and planning and prevention. And notice for the whole first section, I'm not talking about any diseases or ailments. It's all background. And then we're going to take a break and talk about seasickness, scrapes and cuts, and hemorrhage, shock. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I guess yep. When I turn away that way, I have a sound system. I hope you can all hear me. We're going to talk about heat exhaustion and strokes, burns. Then it's going to be lunchtime. We're going to talk about hypothermia, drowning, fractures and dislocations, spine injuries, carbon monoxide poisoning. Then we're going to take a break in the afternoon. Ear, nose, and problems, seizures and convulsions, abdominal problems, heart attack, respiratory infections, head injury, alcohol withdrawal. You don't want to have somebody on board who decided to quit drinking and has delirium tremens. That can be fatal. Seafood poisoning, the unresponsive member, the diagnosis of death, and an itchy anus, which will end the show. And then questions at the end. I want to point out what this is. There's a tree laying across there. If you can see that, it's a tree trunk. Now, every once in a while, I'm going to throw in something that I hope is humorous and breaks the tension. Yes, there is a That's Not My Job award, and it's given every year in the state of Arizona. This won second prize. It's not my job to remove that tree. Okay. Now a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I went to medical school there. This is the University of Pittsburgh. That's the medical school. And then I took a few years general surgical training in Wilmington, Delaware. That's where I met my wife. And then I trained in neurosurgery. What happened here? I trained in neurosurgery at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and practiced in suburban Philadelphia at Bryn Mawr Hospital, Abington Hospital, and I was on the teaching staff at Thomas Jefferson University for 18 years. And then when Brandywine became a trauma center, I headed out there to head up the trauma program briefly. and found out that a neurosurgeon isn't the best chief of a trauma program. So I handed it over to a trauma surgeon. Then in 2003, I retired. And guess what happened? A month later, the war started in Iraq. So I got recruited by the Army Medical Corps to help out backfilling for neurosurgeons in the Army who were being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And my first job was to go out to Fort Bliss, William Beaumont Army Medical Center in El Paso, Texas. My wife and I moved there quickly because they had no neurosurgeon. That's like Walter Reed West. Great place. I was there 3 years and then retired for the second time. And then a few months later, I got a call to help out at Walter Reed. And I was at Walter Reed Medical Center on Georgia Avenue. And then we moved to Bethesda. When they combined the Army and the Navy neurosurgical programs. And this is the Bethesda High Point. It used to be the hospital. Now that's just administrative, and there are a lot of other buildings on the campus. And I had the most rewarding time of my career taking care of these wonderful guys back from Iraq, because my specialty in neurosurgery was trauma, head injury, and spinal cord injury. Now I have some disclosures to make. I have none. I am not, anything that I may show here, I don't have a financial interest in it at all. And then there's a disclaimer. Doctors differ on their opinion, so my opinion as to what should be done may be different. That's why I would like, you were an EMT, weren't you, at one time? So you may have a correction on what I think or an opinion, so please feel free to chime in. Now let's talk about the scene. You may not see this too clear, so I'm going to end up reading a lot of this. It won't be death by PowerPoint, but it may be moribund by PowerPoint. This is halfway between Cape May and Block Island. Now you may be 75. I've done that trip several times in a sailboat, and I was at one time tacking out and back. I was 100 miles offshore. Or you may be halfway between the coast of the United States and Bermuda. United States to Bermuda is 600 miles. If you're halfway in between, that's 300 miles, and that's just about the limit of a helicopter. Or you may be between Hawaii and San Francisco, and that's 2,000 miles. So you'll be at one point you're 1,000 miles off. No helicopter is going to rescue you unless you're the President of the United States, and then they'll send out a C-130 that could refuel the helicopter in the air. Tricky for a helicopter. But the rest of us schleppers are going to have to live with the fact that they're not going to rescue us if we're more than 300 miles offshore. So then transatlantic, you could be 2,000 miles off, but you know in the Atlantic Ocean, you're pretty close to someplace, either Bermuda or the Azores or the Canaries. And I say pretty close, you're within 500 miles probably of some landfall, almost no matter where you are in the Atlantic. So this shows the coast of the United States, Chesapeake entrance. This is Bermuda at 600 miles. Imagine that you're here when you have some kind of a medical emergencies at sea. You're the boss, you have to take care of them. And that's just about at the range where a helicopter can have its limit. Now I've called the U.S. Coast Guard station in Bermuda, and they say they have no long-range recovery. They just have inflatable 16 to 20 feet. They can go out 20 miles, but they don't have helicopters. Now I don't know what Bermuda itself has. And now this is a Bermuda, and this is St. Thomas. Now Bermuda and St. Thomas are both about on 65 degrees west longitude. So that's called Route 65 if you're used to going offshore. So if you're in the middle of Route 65 right here, It's 900 miles between Bermuda. Now you're well beyond any kind of recovery range, and you may not even have communications unless you do what I suggest. Planning and prevention. You're probably going to, if you're going to go offshore, you're going to have a crew and you're going to have a little planning session and sit down and discuss what you're going to do. And one of them is immunizations. What immunizations should you have if you're going to do a long sea trial? Well, tetanus, if you haven't had it for 10 years, a tetanus toxoid vaccine lasts about 10 years. Polio is not needed if you've had one during your adult life. Hepatitis A and B, advised if you're going only to the tropics. There is no vaccine for hepatitis C. Japanese B encephalitis, you don't need that unless you're going to be in Asia. Typhoid in areas of poor sanitation, like some parts of Africa or the Caribbean. How about yellow fever? Only if you're going to Africa. And there are doctors that specialize in travel. So they'll tell you what vaccines you should have. How about measles? If you're born after 1956 and not had a second injection or second vaccine, you should have one. Now, all of this is in the handout I gave you, so there's a permanent record for you. Pre-voyage briefing. The captain is responsible for the safety and comfort of the crew, so the captain or the owner is going to be the chief medical officer. Captain should have access to the health issues and medication of all the crew. But you know what HIPAA says. HIPAA says you don't have to tell anybody anything. So it's really personal. So my recommendation is that you put a copy of your medical record, your medications, in a self-addressed envelope and give it to the captain. And then if you're sick on board, he or she can open it. Otherwise, it's private. And at the end of the voyage, he'll simply mail it back to you, or if you remember, to ask him for it when you get off. I gave one of these to Terry when we did the delivery of your boat from the Bahamas.
And we still practice that policy.
Yeah. You do? Oh, you do.
Yeah. We go out for a long time. Everybody comes with their medical records.
Now, HIPAA means Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, but there's a privacy clause in that says that you don't have to share your medical information with anyone. Now, this is a book called Marine Medicine. It's due for an update. This is 2012, so it's 11 years old, its publication date. And it's by Weiss and Jacobs. You can read that. And I think it's the best, it's about that big. I think it's the best practical guide if you want something to read about medical emergencies at sea. There are a lot of books on it, but some of them are just expanded outlines. They just have a listing of things without actually explaining, but he explains it pretty well. And I've met Jacobs. Now, how about communications? VHF radio, with or without DSC, is no good 25 to 30 miles or more offshore. It's only line of sight from the top of the antenna of your sailboat or powerboat. So my suggestion is that you have a satellite phone, unless you already have a single sideband radio and have long distance communication. You have to be able to call somebody. Well, you can rent a Iridium satellite phone. There are plans from $45 to $65 a week. Has anybody used Iridium? How did it work? Some are waterproof or with built-in GPS, and currently I called up and are charging about $1.85 per minute of verbal conversation. Now, further to what you said, Rob, Iridium makes a Go satellite Wi-Fi hotspot, and this is what it looks like. It's $60 to $70 per week. It can tune in or communicate both with iPhone and Android. Up to 5 devices, that is smartphones, laptops, tablet, unlimited. Does anybody use this?
That's actually what I have right there. Just the Go.
How did it work?
It's good. The apps that you have are specific for the Go, so it's a limited bandwidth. You're not going to be streaming videos or anything like that, but for your basic communications, texting, it's good. The one thing that's kind of weird about it is with that antenna, you still have to have that antenna for your GPS portion to work, because I've got the remote antenna for it, and then the GPS doesn't work. So it's a little funky thing that you got to kind of keep in mind when you mount it. But it's nice that you can put it in your ditch bag and have a self-contained unit, but you also have to have a smartphone to attach to it. You can't use it by itself.
Yeah.
So,
Alan?
When we went to Bermuda, we actually bought cell phones on board that we had rented for that trip. And they were fantastic for getting weather. That was the most thing that we would thank God we didn't need it for medical emergencies. But we were constantly in touch with predict wind and constantly getting weather broadcasts or what we needed to know for our trip. So the satellite phone was fantastic.
You're Julie?
Julianne.
Julianne? So you felt like you could call anybody anytime, right?
Yes.
Day or night?
Yes. The only time that there were issues is if we weren't using the hard-mounted antenna. If you tried to use the Go unit by itself, sometimes it didn't pick up as well.
Okay.
But we could get through, but sometimes it could be a little more difficult.
Sometimes a little delay?
A little bit of a delay. But again, once, because the first time we used it, I didn't have the remote antenna. Once I got the remote antenna on it, I never had any issues with it at all.
Yeah. Now, what's this have to do with the medical talk? Well, it's because rescue is part of your medical care plan. I understand, unless your boat is over 100 feet long, it should handle the whole boat, okay? Now, the portable battery operates 7 hours with talk, 16 hours standby, and it has a USB rechargeable with AC and 12 volt adapters. Was that the case too, Julianne?
I have it plugged in all the time.
Yeah. Now, they told me that the usage charges go by decrements and increments of 20 seconds. So if you use it for a minute and 5 seconds, you're going to get charged for a minute and 20 seconds. Now, suppose you're going to Bermuda and you're heading out the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, Cape Charles, Cape Henry. Right there at Hampton Roads and in the Virginia and Carolinas, you're beyond VHF range. Make sure you have this phone number. Hampton Roads Coast Guard is the coordination area for the whole East Coast of the United States. I called them a couple weeks ago, and the petty officer answered, and I said, are you willing to take calls for emergency situations off the coast? He said, sure, that's our job. So you don't have to worry about setting out EPIRBs and waiting for somebody to find your location, even EPIRBs. You can actually call the petty officer directly, day and night, and they promise to come out and get you. And they have helicopter service up to 300 miles. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, if you're heading to New England, this is the coordination center along the Jersey coast at Atlantic City. And then I think there's one in Newport, one in Chatham, Massachusetts that you can look up. But these are phone numbers that if you're going offshore on the Atlantic side, keep those phone numbers. They're in your handout. Now, the busiest Coast Guard station in the United States is Clearwater, Florida. Here's the phone number. So if you're in the Caribbean, they say South Carolina, Caribbean, Florida, Keys, Bahamas, and the Gulf of Mexico. They do all the rescue for that. And here's their phone number. Now let's talk a little bit about rescue. The new helicopter is the Coast Guard HH-60J. They claim a range of 300 miles. They're at the scene for 45 minutes. They can hoist 6 additional passengers, return to base with plenty of fuel left. They cruise at 140 knots, and their dash speed is 180. With a C-130 transport that can refuel in the air, their range is unlimited, but as I said, unless you're the President of the United States or someone of that ilk, they're probably not going to send a C-130 out for you. Now, Coast Guard cutters' fastest speed right now is about 35 knots, and that's only in smooth water. So to go 350 miles, that's 10 hours. If you're 600 miles, that's 20 hours. And that's after they know about you and get underway. In most cases, they're going 16 to 20 knots. So you do the math. You're about 2 days away from rescue if you're on Route 65 between Bermuda and St. Michael's or St. John's.
A point about Coast Guard cutters is that they're often in motion, and they're not coming necessarily from a port. Our organization rents EPIRBs, and one of the last activations we had, the Coast Guard cutter was on the scene first. You would have thought the helicopter could have been there fastest, but the Coast Guard patrols, mainly to protect our coast, and they were a lot closer than we'd ever dreamed, and fortunately for the people who activated it, the Coast Guard cutter was on scene first.
Also, for rescue, if you contact the Coast Guard, they may redirect the nearest merchant ship to your location. The ship may have a doctor, or certainly will have probably better medical facilities than you have on board for.
Did everybody hear that? And they can call a merchant ship. I guess they know where they are.
There's a whole
Ship traffic. The app Ship Traffic shows commercial vessels worldwide. It's terrific.
Are you speaking about a MAR, Marine Assistance Radio broadcast?
I don't know what they call it now. Back in '85, it was the AMVER, the American Merchant Vessels. But typically, the Coast Guard, if you have a problem that can't be resolved by yourself and they're not going to be around, but there's a ship within 300-400 miles, they may request it to divert. And typically, because of the law of the sea, the captain will take a detour and try to help you out, whether it's 5 gallons of diesel or getting somebody off or getting everybody off and leaving the boat.
So the point being, your nearest help may not be a Coast Guard asset.
Right.
Could be a
Taiwanese or Chinese freighter.
That's great to know. Thanks. Appreciate it.
And it's better if your voyage planning includes at least proximity to a lot of the common shipping routes. So if something does happen, that when they get diverted, it's only a day or 6 hours or something, rather than having to come down 3 or 4 days to get you.
Yes. Thank you. Now, the Coast Guard does have a reconnaissance plane that can travel 240 miles and can be in the air for 10 hours. So you won't be alone. They'll come out and circle. They can't rescue you, but they can drop supplies. They've been known to do that. Now, how about telemedicine assistance? Telemedicine is the coming thing in all medical care, civilian, land-based, and it's particularly helpful on the sea. And I want to tell you about a few. One called Remote Medical International. It's out of George Washington Medical Center in CD, and this is for profit. They do this for profit, so you have to pay. But they say that a doctor will be available 24 hours, 7 days a week, but you sign up in advance, and it's fee-based. And these are 2 numbers. And I know that in 2010, in the Bermuda race, which is sponsored by Eastport Yacht Club, in 2010, all the boats had this available for $95 per boat. Now that's just telephone communication. You want to ask an expert what to do, and you can describe it over the phone. They're not going to come and rescue you, but at least you have medical, or what you call telemedical contact. Does anybody remember when Dan was Driver's Alert Network? It was mainly just for divers. Do you remember that?
Yeah, it was mostly decompression and things like that.
That's out of Duke University, and this is their number. There's a hotline, but now they've morphed into Dan Boater. What you can see, and I should change this slide, there's the word Dan written in red before Boater, Dan Boater, and that's how they put it on the internet. They have red Dan, and then the other word Boater is black or some other color. It's called Dan Boater Safe Passage Program. $60 a year for a person, family can sign up. Membership 24 hours a day hotline. This is the number, same number. They claim they're going to give you $150,000 rescue, land and sea. So they do wilderness calls as well. $25,000 for medical repatriation, and $25,000 search and rescue. If you're a member of the United States Power Squadron, you used to be able to get this for nothing as a benefit for belonging to the Power Squadron. You can sign up on their website. This is the sign-up number from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Again, this says, can't see it, Dan Boater, affiliation with the United States Power Squadron, now called America's Boating Club, is currently being dissolved. Anybody here a member? I know, Mike, you're a Power Squadron. Anybody, I'm a member of the Power Squadron, you are. You automatically, if you've been a member of the Power Squadron for years, you automatically have Dan coverage at no extra charge.
They discontinued it, didn't they?
I'm sorry?
I think they discontinued it.
Well, they're discontinuing. I called them a couple of weeks ago, and they said they're discontinuing any new signups. But if you already have the coverage, they didn't say how long they would honor that. It's probably till you die, Mike. And certainly till I die, because I'm a few years, just a few years away. Maybe even a few days. So at least I know I'm covered for the next few days.
Okay.
Okay, now we get into the little philosophical introduction to my talk, which is that physics and physiology, fed by overconfidence, are superseding controllers of one's fate at sea. And I'll show you something, and I wonder if you know who said this in the first week of October 2012, 3 weeks before Sandy hit.
That was the captain of the Bounty.
The captain of HMS Bounty, the replica. He said, you get a good ride out of a hurricane by sailing as close to the eye as you can. We chase hurricanes. He said that about October 12th, 2012.
Apparently he never read Bowditch.
Yeah. And this is his picture. This is the picture of that boat sinking 90 miles off Cape Hatteras on October 29th, about 3 weeks after he made that statement. Now, he was on the so-called safe side of the hurricane, which is the west side of the normal tropical storm that goes up the east side of the United States. So the wind was behind them. They were running before the sea, and that's what makes it, quote, safe. But this is what happened. Now, the human factor is called, are you willing to act? I don't know what you're willing to do, particularly when you've never done it before, to try to save somebody's life. And a guy named Dr. Joshua Green pondered this problem of one's willingness to do things. When there's no good choice, there are only a selection among undesirable things to do. So he pondered the trolley problem with his class. And you can look this up on the internet. It's called the trolley problem. He said, suppose you're on a trolley that's run away, and unless you pull a lever or a cord, it's going to kill 5 people. But if you pull the lever, it'll be deflected onto a track, which unfortunately will save the 5 people, but it's going to kill 1 person. So there's the gambit, 1 for 5. And you have the handle, and you can pull it. So when he posed that to his class, these were the answers. Easy call, minimize life, utilitarian goals, the right thing to do. And one person says, yeah, well, he's not intending to kill anybody, it's just a side effect of his decision to pull the lever. Then he changed the scenario just a little bit, and this is the second scenario. So he had 2 scenarios. Here's the second scenario. Suppose that the only way you can save the 5 people, now you're not on the trolley, you're on the platform, and you have to push somebody ahead of you onto the track, whose body will stop the trolley and save the 5. But now you're up close and personal. You're responsible for killing that person. Are you willing to do it, or would you do it? When he asked the class that, these were the responses. Now it's still the same gambit, 1 for 5. Most people would say, no, not me, wrong, but why would they pull the lever but not push somebody? So fortunately, he kept asking this every class and every year that he had in philosophy. And now we come to modern times when you can do a functional MRI and find out which part of the brain is thinking with scenario 1 and with scenario 2. So everybody underwent, which means you had to agree to have an injection so that the contrast material that's injected will go to the area of the brain which has the sudden increase in circulation, which is the area of the brain that you're using at that moment. And under scenario 1, pulling the lever, when he asked that, people had a functional MRI thinking about that. This left frontal lobe on all of us is the more or less logical reasoning part of your brain. But when he did scenario 2, this is what lit up. The other side of the brain and a much larger area. Now, in both scenarios, other areas of the brain lit up, but these were the most common ones. And this is the emotional part of your brain. Cingulate gyrus, parietal lobe, that's the sensory input, and it will cause you to have a hiccup or a pain in your stomach when you're contemplating the scenario. Dr. Green concluded that there's an intuitive aversion to giving someone a lethal push, which is stronger than the aversion to pulling a lever. He thought most people would do nothing in either scenario. So what you seek and why you're here today, I'm sorry.
Is that what he actually found, that most people would do nothing?
He thought that. He thought, what would you do? Would you?
Well, it's interesting, nobody ever posed the possibility, what if you yourself jumped on the tracks?
That wasn't posed. That could be scenario 3. Good thought. Did you hear him say, well, what if you jumped on?
Oh, yeah.
So what you seek, what you really seek in a course like this is the knowledge and ability to act reasonably under stress and make tough decisions with respect to human life when there's no good answer. The best answer is to admit the person immediately to a high-quality medical center, but that option is not available. What about this guy? Do you remember Costa Concordia? He just, as a stunt of bravado or a wise guy, just decided to go close to JLo Island. This is, you can't see this island, but he went so close that he ran aground. And 32 died, 64 injured. And I'll tell you later what the outcome was when we get into who's liable and who's at fault. And we'll talk both about Walbridge and the bounty and any lawsuits that resulted from this and what the lawsuits usually turn out to say. Now I want to ask you a question. What do you think a doctor's primary responsibility? What do you think I learned in medical school? I went to medical school in the 50s. Is it to relieve suffering and pain, primarily, right off the bat? Is it to relieve pain and suffering, or is it to save or prolong life?
Neither.
While you're thinking about that, I'm going to get on to the medical, we'll come back to that. You see, I think you can read this. Who's responsible and who's to blame for injuries and illnesses offshore? Is anybody here familiar, I'm sure you are, with the Jones Act? It's based on an English Merchant Shipping Act of 1876. What happened in the 1860s, in the age of sail, was if a seaman or a deckhand was injured, they just put him off at the next port, and that was the end of it. He got no help, no hearing, no recompense, and they brought somebody else aboard until the Jones Act was fashioned. It's considered the devil's own mess. What the Jones Act essentially says is that the owner is always responsible for any injuries or accidents occurring on board on the basis that the boat wasn't seaworthy. Either the boat itself wasn't seaworthy, or the safety equipment wasn't available, like not enough lifeboats, fire extinguishers outdated, or not many of them are not the right type, flares not available or out of date and not working. And that is, the owner's is to blame even if he's not aboard. So the owner is liable for voyages relating accidents regardless of who is at fault. It might include medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering. The court doesn't care that going to sea may be dangerous or just might kill someone. Inherent risk associated with boating is not recognized as a legal defense. Whether the injured seaman contributed to the injury may be irrelevant. We're still talking about the Jones Act. Now, in addition to the Jones Act, let's stop thinking about the Jones Act for a second, in which the owner's responsible. Talk about civil court. That'll involve you, who's ever on the boat, considered the captain or the master, now is under civil tort law. If you're the owner of the boat, you're under both the Jones Act and civil tort. And what does civil tort say? It's based on the rule that the captain, we already talked about, is responsible for the safety and comfort of the crew. So there are two causes of action that go to court under this. One is informed consent, and the other is negligence. Under informed consent, you're supposed to, if you're going to help somebody on your boat, you're supposed to say, George, I'd like to help you, but I need your consent. If George says yes, then explain to George, this is what I plan to do. This is what I hope to accomplish. And enter that in the log. And if George says no, you should probably say something to the effect, well, I believe if such and such isn't done, then such and such will be the outcome, and you record that in the log. Now, you're not used to doing this, because these are good friends, but you should. The second cause of action is negligence. What did you do that contributed or caused harm which produced permanent damage? To try to summarize this, the owner's duty to furnish a seaworthy vessel is absolute, but the definition of seaworthiness is a little slippery, and you'll see that in the case of the Bounty. The captain's duty is to assure safety of the crew. Both civil and Jones Act claims can be adjudicated simultaneously. And if you're also the boat owner and the master who's taking care of it, you can be sued under both simultaneously. Where federal law, of course, supersedes state law. In summary, then, the court wants to know these things. From the boat owner, they want to know, was the vessel seaworthy, and was all the safety equipment present and up to date? Under tort law, the court wants to know, what was the physical or mental state of the captain or master? Was he drunk, on drugs? And were his actions reasonable? And reasonable is kind of a slippery term also. So it's the owner's duty to provide a seaworthy vessel. The provider, the one who renders assistance, has to get consent, and the captain or master or the person delivering has to act reasonably. I want to tell you about an illustrative situation in 1976 called The Spirit. Anybody hear about that epic story? The Spirit was a 42-foot catch. Gross tonnage was 18, which means it's between 40 and 50 feet. Sailed by the owner and his wife and his wife's brother, 8,000 miles from San Francisco to Tahiti, and then back to Hawaii. There they got off for a while because the owner's back was injured and he couldn't make the trip back to San Francisco. But he wanted his boat in San Francisco, so this is what he did. He hired a captain plus 2 experienced males. One was his brother-in-law who had gone with him to Tahiti. And then there were 2 girls in Hawaii who were friends of the 2 guys, the brother-in-law and another guy. And they wanted to go to San Francisco, and they seized the opportunity to get a free ride and a nice sail. Neither of them were experienced at sea. 1 week out, they were making about 6 to 8 knots at night, and they hit something and rolled onto their beam ends. That is, they went all the way over on their, so that the mast was practically in the water. So something hit them, or they hit something. It was probably too big an injury to be a whale. It could have been a container, because there are a lot of containers floating around on both oceans, Atlantic and the Pacific. But also in that particular area, submarines do maneuvers. And you're going to have to tell me, any of you guys who know about submarines, they're supposed to send up a signal or a flare when they're going to surface. Is that right? Do anybody have experience with that? That's what I hear.
No, not in general.
Well, if a submarine came up underneath them, that best explains what happened to them. Because it took the starboard side of the boat away with the lifeline. And attached to the lifeline was their offshore kit, their emergency abandoned ship kit. And at the same time, something flew across the cabin downstairs and down below and smashed the radio. The boat sank in 5 minutes, and they barely had time to inflate 2 Avon dinghies. So they were set adrift at 11:30 at night in 2 Avon dinghies without any ability to save themselves. They had to do what was in the Avon dinghy, which I think is fishing equipment maybe and a knife. 1 week, the castaways in 2 lifeboats, 3 of them were in one and 2 of the other. The captain and one of the guys and a girl in one, and the other one was the owner's brother-in-law and a girl who used to be his girlfriend. So there were 3 in one Avon, 2 in the other. After 11 hours, the dinghies, which were tethered together, parted, and they never saw one another again. The dinghy with that had 3 in it, on day 28, a U.S. Coast Guard, there was 1 survivor on board. The captain said the other 2 died due to starvation and dehydration. And that was the one that had the captain and an experienced man and the girl, and the experienced man and the girl had already died during that time. The owner, I already mentioned, due to a backache, did not make the voyage, but he was considered liable under the Jones Act, that the boat somehow wasn't seaworthy. He got $70,000 for the loss of the boat from the insurance company. There were suits filed against the Avon rafts, but they had no trouble defending. Their Avon dinghies were loaded with the usual things, but they threw $200 into it. Remember, this is 1976. The owner was never sued for loss of life, possibly because one of the deceased was his brother-in-law. The surviving female was awarded $45,000, and the mother of the deceased was given $70,000, but these were set aside on appeal, so nothing was really paid. The mother of the surviving female considered filing some lawsuits, but never did. So this is an example of lawsuits of accidents that actually have happened and how the lawsuits turn out. Now I have good news and bad news. The good news is that the courts see things entirely differently for ocean or sea injuries and accidents. They don't give any money to anybody, or they are reluctant to give money because they say you knew or should have known that it was dangerous to go to sea. Entirely different than an automobile accident or injuries that happen on land. That's the good news. The bad news is there's still a big problem with not being prepared or having accidents happen that are no fault of your own in a perfectly seaworthy boat. And by the way, it was never, ever decided what hit their boat or what they hit. Now let's talk about the Bounty. There were 15 aboard, and I think it was a marvelous rescue. All that were in the water, which was 15, were all saved within about 2 hours out of the Coast Guard station in Elizabeth City. They didn't find Claudine Christian. She was a crew member and claimed to be a descendant of Fletcher Christian, who was on the original Bounty. But who knew what? She was found floating and unresponsive. I think she was probably dead, but they did CPR on her and she was pronounced dead at Albemarle. That's what you are going to say. Bring us up to date. The captain was never found, but I have a hint as to what happened to him. Remember those survival suits? At least to his credit, the captain recommended that everybody don a survival suit. He needed help to get his on because he had injured his back. And what really had happened is they were tossed around so much from, I guess they left Connecticut or Rhode Island, and they were off, by that time, a few days later, off 90 miles off Cape Hatteras. And something hit and broke the glass fuel tube on the port side. And without anybody knowing it, it emptied all the fuel on that side into the bilge. The generator stopped. That meant the pump stopped and the engine stopped on the port side, and they never got it running again. And because of that, they thought that they were taking about 30,000 gallons of water on per hour. It was only a matter of time that when they went down to when they went down. And this is the picture taken from the rescue helicopter. Now, the water filled up so fast that the other engine stopped also, flooded with water. If you look at this photograph, there's a little red mark here. I think it's, when I looked at it, now this is the bow of the boat because it said it was leaning to port. There's a little red coloring right there next to the foremast, and I wondered whether that was Captain Walbridge clinging to his boat to go down. I don't know. He was never found, but he ordered everybody off boat after they donned their survival suits. There were 3 lawsuits filed, and under the stipulation, the guy who owned the boat at the time, named Robert Hansen, one of the deals he made with the court was that the settlement details would not be public. The Acadia, not ACADIA, insurance company paid Robert Hansen, who owned the boat at the time, $5.1 million for the boat. He paid $4.6 million for it. But the insurance company gave him 5.1. Later on, the insurance company wanted their money back once they heard the details, because they were certainly sure that the boat wasn't seaworthy at the time that they wrote the insurance policy, and they were misinformed about that. 10 years later, just last year, a judge in New York ruled against the insurance company, saying that they didn't prove their case, that the boat wasn't seaworthy, so the insurance company never got their money back. I think Robert Walbridge had a 500-ton Coast Guard license at the time. Any questions about that or any comments? Fill in any details about that? Now, this was on the 29th of October, and he made that statement on the 12th of October about that they love hurricanes. The Coast Guard inspected the boat when it was in New England, in Connecticut, and found it was not usable for passengers. They considered it an uninspected seaside attraction because it wasn't suitable for passengers, unless the passengers were crew members. And that's how they were managed to cast off, and they were going to take the boat to Florida to participate in a fundraising event for Mongolism. So I read. Anybody read anything differently? Or any new law, any outcome of the lawsuits? Now, this is what happened to the Concordia. The parent company, which is Carnival Lines, offered everybody on board 11,000 euros. That's about $14,000. 1/3 of them accepted, and the other thirds decided to wing it or do their own lawsuit. The captain took the whole blame. Under any kind of investigation, the Jones Act fell away. There was no problem with the boat. So Schettino took the full blame. He got 16 years in jail, so right now he's still in jail. He got 10 years for manslaughter. He got 5 years for the loss of the ship, and 1 year for abandoning the boat. Now, the captain's supposed to stay aboard and be the last one off. He was one of the first ones off, so he got a year tacked on for that. And there are hundreds of lawsuits pending, even probably as we speak. Okay, let's get back to the question I asked you. What do you think a doctor's primary response was? Just prolong life or to relieve pain and suffering? Well, I'll tell you right off the bat, I was taught to relieve pain and suffering primarily. And that the life was secondary, because if you prolong the life, you may just prolong the suffering. And they wanted doctors to think about that. Think about it before you save someone's life. And how long is it going to be prolonged? For an hour, 2 hours, a week? So that's what to think about. We were taught to relieve the pain and suffering, but it depends upon what we call triage. Now, what's triage? Well, the two basic concepts in triage is sorting out, That is, if there are 2 people injured or 3, you have to go to the one who's most injured and has established priorities thereby. Admonition to doctors, primum non nocere. Now that's a Latin phrase, but it was said by Hippocrates, who was Greek. So I don't know whether he said it in Greek, but it was somehow translated into Latin, because primum non nocere is not Greek, that's Latin, which means first do no harm. When you translate that concept into being offshore and you're the captain, that means don't intentionally put yourself or anybody else in harm while you're trying to administer to the lost person or the overboard guy or the injured person. Now, the 3 aspects to triage, and I think we all know this inherently, but I think it's good to repeat it. Number 1, there are those who will survive regardless of what you do. Under those circumstances, of course, pain relief is the primary goal. Number 2, there are people that are going to die no matter what you do. And while they're alive, pain relief is still the primary goal. And then the third group is the missing one here, and that's where your treatment will make a difference between saving their life or not. And under those circumstances, saving the limb or the life suddenly becomes the preeminent thing. Now, when I first gave this lecture in 2009, something was possible then which may not be possible now, and you'll have to tell me. In 2009, I advised the audience that if they're going to do an offshore trip, they need stronger medicine than Tylenol or aspirin or Advil. That won't handle it. It really wouldn't, particularly if somebody has a heart attack and they have very severe chest pain. Tell you the truth, some of them want to die. They look because the pain is so bad, and they don't know how long it's going to last, or whether they're going to live or die. So it's not only pain, it's anxiety. And in 2009, I told the people here, like you, next time you see your doctor, sit down and ask him if he would write you a prescription for either Percocet, or if you have a problem with Percocet, because it makes a lot of people nauseated, and or to get hydrocodone, which is another artificial opioid, which has less chance of producing nausea, but it's not quite as strong as oxycodone. Now, oxycodone comes in the trade name Percocet, and it not only has an opiate in it, it has Tylenol mixed with it for whatever benefit that gives. Same with Vicodin, which is the trade name of hydrocodone, which also has Tylenol mixed with it. When I gave that first court, I brought my prescription pad and I wrote everybody in the audience a prescription for 2 medications, one for pain, heavy duty, like this, that you can depend upon it working. And I also ordered them an anti-anxiety medication. Remember, there was Valium first. And because it took so long to act, about an hour, and once it acted, it was 12 hours before it wore off. The pharmaceutical company went to work and they produced a modification called Syrax. You may have remembered that. That lasted a little while, but still wasn't good enough. Then they came out with Ativan. Everybody remember Ativan? Now it's Xanax. You know what Xanax is? That's kind of the latest. Fast acting, short acting. But Ativan was the darling drug for anxiety in 2009. 1 milligram tablets, and I wrote everybody a prescription for 12 of those too. At that time, there was no problem going to a pharmacy and getting it filled. Lots has happened since 2009. And I'm not sure you're going to get, I'm not sure, but you can tell me if you have a doctor who's a close friend, particularly in Annapolis, because most doctors in Annapolis own a boat, and they know exactly what you're talking about. And believe me, they all have an opiate and an anti-anxiety medication in their offshore first aid kit or medical kit. So all I would say is, and if you have a doctor who's a good friend in Annapolis, sit down and say, gee, doc, I need more than time. I don't know if I'm going to do an offshore trip. But somebody could break their arm or break their leg, have a heart attack. And I need not only a pain reliever, but I need something that combats anxiety. And with somebody who has a heart attack, that's one of the few ways you're going to save their life, is to relieve their pain and their anxiety. Because the anxiety causes their blood pressure to go up and their heart to beat faster. And if nothing else kills them, that will. But we're going to talk about heart attacks in a minute, so I'll say that. Now when it comes to, we talked about it's to save life versus relieve pain and suffering. It's called the ABCs, and that's something that Alan teaches, so I'm not going to go into the basic life support, which is airway, breathing, and circulation. So that's your job, Alan.
Yeah, just one comment. For those that took my class, what's the most important part of CPR? Circulation. It's no longer ABC, it's CAB. Circulation before anything else.
Circulation first, huh? Yeah. Good, thank you. And Alan, you can comment on this. At one time, it was CPR always included breaths, 2 breaths, 30 heartbeats. And then a few years ago, they decided that most people who collapse and need CPR are adults, 50, 60 years of age, and it's usually the heart. So it became hands only, which is the way it is now. And I have 2 saves with hands only CPR, 100 times or so a minute. And the first person I did this on was a few years ago. She collapsed right in the front entrance area, and I pumped on her chest. She was blue, not breathing. I couldn't detect a heartbeat. I pumped on her chest. She turned pink. She actually began to move, and I'm not sure whether they were reflex movements or voluntary movements. I thought, oh, maybe I didn't feel the pulse. So I stopped, and she went right back to being blue and motionless and no heartbeat. So I kept going until somebody had already called 911. And it was one of those things where they came into the dining room and said, is anybody a doctor? Are you a doctor? I was the first, sitting at the first table, and I said, yes, I am. And then they told me, and I went out and did that. Well, the EMT showed up. They put the electrodes on her, and when they shocked her, her heart rhythm came back, and she woke up, and off she went to the hospital, and I got a nice note from her about 6 weeks later, so it was a nice thing. And then I had a similar occurrence at Longwood Gardens, hands only. Would you comment on that, Alan?
Sure. Hands-only CPR does in fact work, as long as you're well within a couple minutes of getting a ambulance to you. But you can't do 100 to 120 compressions for very long without yourself being extremely tired. And for high-quality CPR, we still recommend full CPR, which means giving breaths.
Yeah.
So we recommend that for the untrained people who have never taken a CPR class or certainly haven't taken one recently, the hands-only CPR does in fact work. We've proven that for a short period of time.
Yeah. Now there are 4 situations where hands only doesn't work. You have to use breaths. And that's, you may not see that, but it says children under 12. Most likely in kids, if they collapse and fall, it's a pulmonary condition. And it's not so sudden. The symptoms warn you that they are having trouble with breathing. The second thing is a person who's a known or a suspected drug abuser, in which the problem is pulmonary, is breathing. And the third thing is a drowning situation. And the fourth thing is carbon monoxide poisoning. We're going to talk about that later. And then you revert to 30 compressions and 2 breaths. Now, medical kits, and we're getting near break time, so if you're getting a little nervous, I don't have long to go. Talk about medical kits, and I have a suggestion for you for medical kits, and that's coming up soon. I have this $15 one on my boat. It's useless except for scratches, maybe a dog bite, but even it might not be enough for a dog bite. And then $23 for this, and Adventure makes these. Here's $32. The price goes up to $125. Here's one for $300 or $800. It's called the Adventure Medical 300. And if you buy this, you get that Weiss and Jacob book as part of it. It's inside the kit. And now the price goes up because you can get a medical kit that has a blood pressure cuff in it, and IV solutions with tubing, needles, $7,000. And where do you look for that? You either go to West Marine, or there are magazines like Landfall that advertise almost all of the available medical kits. I always carry an AED, and it looks like this because CPR is of no value. What are you going to do this forever? You have to have some way of stimulating the heart, an electroshock, and this is the one I have. I actually bought this because Alan said it was the best one at the time. And I'll just play what it says.
Adult patient, call for medical assistance. Remove clothing from patient's chest to expose bare skin. Pull green tab to remove pads. Peel.
Now it tells you to peel this off. I don't want to ruin this, so I can put this back in here. But these are the electrodes. You know, one goes about here under the clavicle, and the other one goes on the side. It's not exact, but one about here, one about there. And it will tell you, it'll monitor whether there is an electrical heartbeat that you can actually feel the pulse, because the blood pressure is so low, so weak, but this will detect it. And then it'll say, do not shock. It'll tell you that. Or it'll say shock. And it'll tell you to get away, don't touch the patient. It gives you all those instructions. And then you can do an electrical shock. And that's what really saves the person's life. It's this. It's not pressing on their chest. Pressing on their chest will keep them alive until you can get an AED or until the EMT comes. But you're on Route 65. You're 400 miles away from the closest landslide. So you've got to have something like this. Are you willing to invest in something like this? So my advice is to make your own medical kit. This is part of mine, and this is what I carry. You'll see that, and this is a locked ammo box, because I have to keep narcotics under lock and key by regulation. And this ammo box is this one here, and I brought it today. I didn't bring the other two, because I have some things in here that I want to show you. I don't know whether you can tell, doctor's strike, and my handwriting is about like that. Whenever I have a silly slide, that means it's time for a break. So I'll see you all in about 15 minutes.